Good evening. So about once a month here at St. Gabriel in South St. Louis, we have what we call Friends Food and Faith. We just started it about 4 or 5 months ago, maybe December, maybe it was January. Um, and it's really directed towards talking about the whys of the faith rather than the whats. The thought being that a lot of people, Catholic, non-Catholic, they kind of know what the church teaches, but they don't necessarily know why. Obviously, it was just pointed out to me by Monsignor Simon, which is a good point, is because Jesus and the church are one. Obviously, there's a marital bond there that the two become one flesh, and that you can't have one with the other, because Jesus gave us the church as our guide. And so, what the church says, it's basically what the teachings of Christ, because that's been handed down from the apostles and what's been taught throughout the millennia. But we try to focus maybe on some more rational reasons why the church teaches what she does. That's kind of this whole concept that was handed down through generations, Thomas Aquinas, and really championed by John Paul II, faith and reason. That faith really and reason, they go together. That whatever we find in faith, there's a rational reason why we teach it. And they don't really conflict with each other. Same thing with like faith and science. Faith and science don't conflict. The church has always taught that. As a matter of fact, the scientific method and a lot of the scientific findings have come from the church. People don't necessarily realize that, but they don't conflict with each other. They coincide with each other, and they build upon each other. Faith obviously is primary; that's a virtue. But knowledge also is a virtue too. It's a fruit of the Holy Spirit. So it's a gift of the Holy Spirit. So we don't find these conflicting with each other. We find them to actually support. John Paul II put it as two wings that bring us all to heaven. So tonight we're going to discuss kind of a controversial topic, but it's one that's also kind of timely. It's been going on for a long time now, and it has definitively been taught, but a lot of people don't really understand why, especially in the light of a lot of our brothers and sisters in other faiths that kind of still practice this thing the church doesn't practice, namely women ordination, or in church's case, the lack thereof. So tonight we're going to discuss why the church does not ordain women. This kind of also goes with what we talked about last month in March, which was the reason why the church doesn't practice, the church priesthood practices the discipline of celibacy, meaning that the Catholic priests and bishops, deacons can, but they have to be married before they're ordained a deacon. Why priests don't get married. And it's not, as we discussed last month, it's not an issue of essence, meaning it's not essential to the priesthood that they not be married. We actually do have plenty of married priests, not only in the Roman Catholic Church, but also in the Eastern churches that priests are allowed to marry again before they're ordained. But it's really more an issue of practicality. That first off, obviously, Jesus was celibate. That's always been taught and been verified over the centuries, even though there's some modern thought that maybe he married Mary Magdalene, which is the Dan Brown type of understanding, but there's no evidence for that. It's just not true. Jesus remained a celibate his entire life here on earth. And which really, as a priest, that makes sense, that when they dedicate their life to conform themselves to Jesus Christ, they're trying to follow in his footsteps as best they possibly can, meaning they shouldn't get married. More so from practical reason, the reason is that in order to actually serve the people that the man has been ordained to serve, they have to be free to actually serve them. So obviously, if a man had a wife and children, that would take priority in their lives. And the church has always taught that, even with a permanent diaconate, or even our married priests, it's understood that their first vocation is to their family. So if every priest got married and had a family, you could theoretically believe there's a point where if there was an issue between their parishioners and their family, their parishioners would not be served in the way they need to be served. So it's really a discipline of the priesthood to maintain celibacy, not necessarily essential to the priesthood. So it's important to make that distinction. We get kind of confused by a lot of people in that respect. So that's kind of what we talked about last month. We went for a full 2 hours. If you want any information, you can contact me, or you can write in the comments page. Live chat is open. So if you have any questions, if you're watching right now, you can go ahead and ask questions online. Also, our Zoom page is going right now, and I can send out the Zoom meeting notice on the web chat to allow some people to join in. Um, I'll actually send that right now. So yeah, so if you want to join the conversation, feel free, come on in. If you just want to sit back and watch and maybe listen, that's cool too. But we will kind of get going here in the next 2 or 3 minutes, depending on who kind of writes in. I know that's kind of the usual group that comes here are probably more of the older ilk. They're a little more of our senior members of our parish, which is awesome. We love them. We want them to kind of join in, engage. But also, they may not be as savvy when it comes to technology, as we all have some limitations. Even I, as a 40-year-old man, I have limitations as far as my technology prowess too. Um, but feel free to come in. I can have up to 250 people in the Zoom meeting room. So you're more than welcome as long as there's room. But yeah, feel free to hang out, see what you want. Maybe learn something. Who knows? But basically, just have fun. And join us in our understanding of the teaching of the Catholic Church, and hopefully we'll just have a good time tonight. And now, typically, we would actually do this with we call it Friends, Food, and Faith because we usually meet in person, obviously, and we actually kind of set up more of a potluck style here in the basement of our rectory. We have this great meeting room called the fireplace room, and it's really just a great place to hang out. And we have a lot of our meetings here in the parish. So we should get started here in the next few minutes, and we're waiting for people to come online. If we don't have anyone join, that's fine. I have a little thing I can say, and then we can just go from there. But hopefully, have some people joining and make it a little more interesting. That's really been the best part of these conversations. Is really the people that have questions, the people that have comments. So yeah, it's fun. So we hopefully should have some good times here tonight, and we'll talk to you in a few minutes. Well, perhaps we didn't get the word out quick enough, or maybe just people are watching and will want to watch later. That's fine too. So, kind of go to some historical context of the topic of women ordination. So, it's been brought up recently, especially with the recent Amazon Synod by Pope Francis and the bishops of the Amazon, South America. The question of women ordination was brought up again because of the lack of priests in South America. And the Holy Father still upheld the teaching that women cannot be ordained to the Catholic priesthood. The reason I ask this is why. Well, let's go some history. First off, um, we did have deaconesses back in the early times of the church, and we asked ourselves, well, why do we have deaconesses? So it seems like we have deaconesses back then. We should be able to have women deaconesses today. We have to understand what the deaconesses really were, though. So there were women that were put into ministries to specifically help with the baptisms of other women. Because back then, in the early church, we didn't, the church we've always has infant baptisms today, but back then, it's very similar to the rite you would see at our Easter Vigil coming up very soon, where adults would be baptized. And to be baptized, they were actually baptized in the nude. So it would be very improper, unchaste, imprudent for a male bishop at that time to actually take a naked woman and baptize her fully immersed into the baptismal font. And back then, the baptismal fonts were like kind of entire rooms. So it was always do by baptism by immersion. And in order to maintain a proper boundary, I just lost my outlet. Main proper boundary, the women would actually do the physical baptizing of the other women, meaning fully immerse them, while the bishop would say the words of baptism. I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So as time went on, the practice came to not baptize in the nude anymore, and so the need for the deaconesses in that ministry were no longer necessary. So those deaconesses became the first abbesses, and the abbess was kind of a leader of a different order, and the first leaders of the female religious orders that we still even have today. Carmelites and well, not Franciscans, share a little bit later, but a lot of the orders that we have today, women religious, they were started back even in the early parts of the church, and the first leaders of those communities were deaconesses. So they weren't ordained positions; they were what we call instituted. So an institution would be that a bishop would actually pray over a person and basically set them apart for a specific ministry. That's different than ordination. There was no character involved. When we talk about character, I mean that there's an imprint on the soul with a character that you receive in baptism, you receive in confirmation, and one would receive in holy orders. Even today, we have certain stages that a man would go through on their ordination path. So before they were ordained a deacon, which is the first level of holy orders, they would go through these levels of institution. They would go through the rite of candidacy, meaning that they're kind of dedicating their lives to learning more and even growing. That even if they're not ordained a priest, they would still have that aptitude to actually keep learning about the faith. Then they would be instituted as a lector, meaning they could proclaim the readings at Mass, which kind of lost some luster after Vatican II because more lay people would actually take up that role. But even lay people could be instituted as lectors. Then acolyte, which would be like a server, which allowed the person to purify vessels. And again, even a lay person can actually be instituted as an acolyte. Before Vatican II, there was these stages of porter and lector and exorcist and acolyte and subdeacon and deacon and now then the priesthood. And actually, the clerical state actually started with what we call candidacy, but holy orders weren't given until the subdiaconate. Well, after Vatican II, the subdiaconate was taken away, and the diaconate became the first order of holy orders. But the deaconesses in the early church were not actually ordained. They were instituted in these positions. So it's important to make that distinction, that we hear these things about deaconesses and people tend to think, oh, we ordained them in the past. Well, we didn't ordain women in the past. We instituted them as deaconesses. Really, the crux of this issue is more theological based, though. Again, history, we have to understand, when was holy orders actually instituted? Well, the sacrament, as the Catholic Church understands it, of holy orders was instituted by Jesus at the Last Supper. A lot happened at the Last Supper. So the Eucharist, of course, was instituted. And it's no coincidence that when the Eucharist was instituted, first was instituted was the priesthood. And it was instituted at the point where Jesus washed the feet of the apostles. We kind of look at their first order, the diaconate, started by Jesus in that moment, because the diaconate is an order of service, service at the altar, service at the table, which is what Jesus did when he washed the feet of the first apostles. And then at the institution of the Eucharist, when Jesus says the words, "This is my body and this is my blood," he ends that narrative, those words of institution, those consecrating words with, "Do this in remembrance of me." So by saying that, what he's telling his disciples is, do what I'm showing you to do. You can make my body and blood present sacramentally in the context of this liturgy. So he's basically, at that point, he's ordaining the apostles. Now, what about that moment? So first off, we might want to say that if anybody deserved to be ordained a priest, it would have to be the Virgin Mother, Mary. But yet Mary was not at that Passover celebration. Partially because at that time, the women and men were always divided in the celebration of the Passover. The women would go with the women, the men would go with the men. Now, we may argue, well, why would Jesus? Jesus kind of broke social norms all the time. So why wouldn't he invite the Virgin Mother, or even Mary Magdalene for that matter, or the other Marys as mentioned in the Bible? Well, that's a good question. And that actually kind of solidifies the reason why Jesus didn't ordain them. He didn't invite them. Jesus was not really big on those social norms. That's correct. But yet he still maintained that separation of the sexes when it came to that final supper with his disciples. So that may raise some questions. Well, why would Jesus do that? Well, ultimately, we don't know. Maybe we have to ask him when we get to heaven one day. But Mary and Mary Magdalene were not at that celebration. They were not at that Passover dinner. They were not at that Last Supper. So they were not there to receive the Eucharist at that time or to be ordained in those orders. But also, if we look a little deeper, we can understand a little bit further why Jesus didn't invite them. This really kind of coincides with Catholic anthropology, that we have an understanding that men and women, while equal in their dignity and their soul, they are different. They are given different gifts, not only bodily, but also mentally and emotionally. And Jesus came to this earth as a man. Could he have come as a woman? Sure. But he came here, he was incarnated as a man. And when he gave us the Eucharist, he gave us the Eucharist as a man. And if we understand the holy orders, what they are, especially the priesthood, that you're standing in persona Christi, meaning the priest is in the person of Christ, standing as Jesus, giving the people Jesus' body and blood as Jesus, it would have to be as a man. Women and men are different. That's true. Whether we want to think it or feel it differently, the truth is that men and women are different. And if Jesus came to earth as a woman, we may have a completely different discussion right now. But ultimately, that's what it comes down to. Jesus was incarnated, was born of the Virgin as a man. And when he gave himself to those disciples sacramentally at the Last Supper and told them to do this in remembrance of me, he was telling them to give the people me sacramentally in this body and blood that was first bread and wine as me. That you are configured in holy orders, given this imprint, this character that conforms with me. So that when you're saying those words, "This is my body, this is the chalice of my blood," you're not saying that as Father Mark Madden or Monsignor Joseph Simon or Monsignor Schamoff or whoever priest. You're saying that as Jesus Christ himself. And you're giving yourself in your priesthood through that Eucharist to your people. So that it has to be given as a man. That's caused a lot of controversy over the years. But it really didn't come to a head until really kind of more and more after Vatican II. And the reason being, maybe, is that after Vatican II, there was more of an openness to engage with the laity. Before Vatican II, when you look at the liturgy, it was really just the priest and maybe the male servers that were there that were actually kind of participating more in the liturgy than everyone else. They were just kind of there and they would say the prayers, and most people that were in the congregation, they could pay attention to what's going on, but they had their own prayer books typically, and they were praying either the rosary or some other prayers. Some may have been praying along with the Mass, but the Mass also was in Latin. And as time went on, the understanding, the practice of learning Latin kind of fell to the wayside. But after Vatican II, there was more of an engagement we call active participation, which is different than activism. We're taught that active participation is more of an internal disposition, a giving of ourselves as our baptismal priesthood, which is different than ministerial. So when one is baptized, they are baptized as priest, prophet, and king through the office of Jesus Christ. But in the liturgy, everyone is offering a sacrifice as a priest, but it's a spiritual sacrifice, which differs from the ministerial priesthood. The ministerial priest is giving himself as a man, as Jesus would to us in the Eucharist. And that's kind of the distinction we have to make. But there was more of a participation by laity after Vatican II in the liturgy. So we started having women who would be able to serve at the Mass or become what we call extraordinary ministers. So that was the first time that concept was really brought about. Before that, the ministers of the Eucharist was always a priest or a deacon. But now, after Vatican II, we have lay people that can actually act in those ministries, which is awesome. It's great that they can actually participate in that. But also women and men who could read at the Mass, serve in the Mass, perform these ministries, which prior to that were really only given to those who were either in holy orders or in a clerical state driving towards holy orders. So there was a thought that maybe that, oh, well, if that's the case, then, what's the difference between someone who's lecturing before and then, this young woman or this older lady who's ministering at the Mass and the priesthood who's just saying the words of consecration and, bringing the Eucharist about. What's the difference there? Well, the difference is one is ordained to the ministerial priesthood. The other one has been instituted for a particular ministry based on their common priesthood. So that's kind of the gist, and there was brought up that maybe this could be a question could be raised. And really, it's always been kind of taught that the ministerial priesthood was reserved for men because of the arguments we brought forth. But it wasn't until John Paul II, in his Dignitaris Mulieribus exhortation, that he definitively said, basically with his papal authority infallibly, that the Catholic priesthood is reserved for men. So it's been brought up, though, after that, since, obviously we've seen it even with Benedict and recently with Pope Francis, who, even before the Synod, made comments that he's not looking to overturn that teaching of the Church. And really, at this point, he really can't. I shouldn't say he can't. He definitely could. But because of that intimacy with the Eucharist, it'd be very hard to argue for women priesthood based on those, on what we understand the Eucharist to be, understand Jesus' actions at the Last Supper. And that's kind of where we're at today. Of course, we saw the Amazonian Synod. They decided not to, the Pope said that he was not going to overturn that, that we need to be more prayerful in praying for vocations to the priesthood, which I think is the correct way to go. We can talk about the implications that could have the global church if the Pope decided that women could be ordained in the Amazon. We can talk about maybe how that could be implemented, and we even talk about the priesthood crisis, because that's kind of what's driving all this. Whether it be priesthood celibacy or women ordination, there's an understanding that we need priests. And that's true. I mean, in most countries around the world, unless you're in Africa or Asia right now, um, there's a lack of men coming to the priesthood. And that doesn't mean they're not being called to the priesthood. It just means that maybe there aren't people being either hearing the call, open their ears to it, or maybe having the courage enough to say yes to it. It's important also to take into account the female orders because as the women orders go, so goes the priesthood. And it's no coincidence that we've seen a decline in our religious sisters, that we also see a decline in our priests. A lot of orders out there are kind of getting to a point where their median age is in their 70s, and that's not sustainable. So I think it's a both and here. We need to pray for an increase in religious sisters and pray for those orders that are doing really well that they can grow and strengthen. For the orders that aren't doing well, we can pray for that they start doing well or that they end. That's also an option too. The Lord may be calling them to stop their ministry and focus maybe something else. But ultimately, we have to pray for more women religious because those are the ones that drive the spiritual nature of the priesthood. It's that spiritual motherhood that kind of drives the spiritual fatherhood of the priests. Makes sense. So that could really be the issue why, but that's kind of what drives a lot of these arguments is that we need priests. So let's just do whatever we can to get more priests. Doesn't matter if they're men or women or LGBTQA or transgender or whatever. We need people to start. If we start opening this up to all these options, we'll get more priests. And that's kind of a faulty argument too. There's really nothing to indicate that really would be the case. Even open up the celibacy for the priesthood, well, that doesn't necessarily ensure that more men are going to become. There may be an uptick in certain areas, but universally, that may not actually help the problem. And in reality, it's going to cause more problems than maybe it would actually help. So I agree with the Holy Father that we need to really start praying for more vocations. That's really the key. And start with women religious. Let's just start praying for more women religious vocations, and then the priesthood will come. Here in St. Louis, we kind of been blessed that we actually have typically have an ordination every year. This year we're ordaining 2 men to the priesthood, which is great. We're ordaining 6 men to the diaconate. Eventually, I'm not sure if that's still going to be on the same time this year, but with all this going on, we'll find out. But also, you see a lot of strong women religious in this area too. So it's no coincidence that as you see these great women religious in these different areas, you typically find the priesthood is doing better in those areas. Now, granted, we're not doing the best. I mean, we could have more men come to the priesthood and more women come to the religious life. But compared to some of our surrounding dioceses, we're doing okay. Considering that some of the dioceses around us, they don't have an ordination for like 5 years at a time. We kind of boast here in St. Louis we're doing all right. But we're getting to this point where coming up in about 8-9 years, we're going to start plateauing we're going to have just as many priests as we have positions in the archdiocese to be met. And we're already kind of experiencing kind of a shortage now with certain things. So we start consolidating more, that might kind of help things. But we're basically kind of losing about 10 men a year to retirement or death or going home to our Lord. And we're only ordaining on average about between 5 and 6 guys a year. My class last year, we had 7 guys, which is great. That's a great number. It's, I think, the second highest in 20 years. But we're only ordaining 2 this year. Now, part of that's the way formations kind of worked out. Not really anyone's fault. But then we go up to 6, and hopefully coming up, we'll kind of maintain that rate, which is good. But we just have to pray. Pray for more vocations. Pray that men and women will stand up to follow God's call to religious life and the priesthood. And eventually, it will work itself out. The Lord has a plan for His church. He's not going to lead it astray. And He's going to find people to stand up to take these roles and follow them. And then the other thing, too, we have to take into consideration that leadership roles in the church, they can be by men and women. There's nothing saying they have to be a priest or a deacon or a bishop to take leadership role in the church. I mean, obviously here in the parish, we have many men and a lot more women that stand up in these leadership roles. And actually, if they didn't, we'd be lost. We'd be destroyed as a parish and as a church. We understand the dignity of women. We uphold the dignity of women. We love women. But also we have to ask ourselves sometimes, most of the times we get these conversations, it's not the issue of, it's really more of an issue of power. That many people say, well, there's just this male hierarchy, that they just want power. And well, to tell you the truth, any person that said they got ordained to have power, they're either lying to you or they don't understand the priesthood. I didn't become a priest to gain power. If I wanted power and money and prestige, I would have stayed where I was. I was well, in case you don't know, I was an engineer for 10 years, mechanical engineer. Went to school at Rolla. I got a degree in mechanical engineering. I worked for a very prestigious aerospace company based out of Chicago, the largest in the world, for 10 years. And I was doing all right. I was a man, had a pretty good reputation. I was reputable. I was kind of a place of honor. I had more power in that position than I do as a priest. Now, granted, I was making kind of life and death decisions on a daily basis when it came to the production, the manufacturing, the design of an airplane. But now I'm in charge of something more precious, which is the soul. And not just a soul, but the souls of all the people in my parish. So that's really the job of a priest, is they're a servant. Their job is to serve the people to elevate their souls to God. And that's what it's about. It's a position of service, not of power. And so just because we're in a position of service, there is a great power given to us to actually confect the Eucharist, to actually bring about the body and blood of Jesus Christ. But that's where our power ends. Governance can be done by anybody. We can. But only the priest can actually bring about Jesus present on the altar. And that's really what it's all about. It's about serving people, bringing them Jesus in their life. And you don't have to be a priest to do that. But ultimately, when we get these conversations, that's what it comes down to. It's a question of power, not of service. And I would say that any person, male or female, who wants to get in the priesthood because of power, well, they're getting it for the wrong reasons. It's not about that. It's about serving the people that God puts in your care. So there are some reasons why the church, what she teaches what she teaches about ordination or lack thereof. Looks like nobody joined. We got a couple people looks like tuned in, which is great, but this will be online. If you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the comment section, contact me directly. Hope this was helpful. We'll meet hopefully in person next month. I'm not sure what topic will be. Keep tuned to the webpage, to the bulletin. We'll figure it out as we go. I have some ideas. We talk about marriage, generally marriage. So I'm praying for you. Hope everything's going well. God bless you, and stay strong, stay healthy, and let the Lord enter your life.